Lots of people are interested in doing good things to make our world a better place. And Americans, on the whole, donate about 2% of the US domestic product, or almost $500 billion to charities. And that is a lot of money and has the potential to do a lot of good. But charities can vary enormously in how much good they do per, say, the dollar spent. And which charities people give to and how much they give are actually psychological issues. And today we're going to get into that with Dr. Matthew B. Coleman, who has a PhD in psychology, specializing in how people interact with global risk and effective giving. And currently, he's the executive director of Giving Multiplier. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Well, let's talk about charities for a minute. I think people might know that charities vary in how effective they are. But do you think they might underestimate this?
Yeah, they do. And there's research that shows this is the case. So most of us understand that, not all charities are equally impactful in terms of like per dollar donated. But the thing is, we drastically underestimate just how much they vary. So research led by Lucius Caviola found that people typically think that the difference between a typical charity and the best charity is something like 1.5 times, so like 50% greater. And this is kind of like the difference in height between a short person and a tall person.
Okay.
But actually, the experts say this is something like 100 times greater or perhaps even more, which is more like the difference between a person and, say, a skyscraper. So people really just drastically underestimate just how big this gap is. And me today, I'm still astounded with really what the implications of this gap means. If you think about it, it suggests that we might be able to do more good with even as little as $10 as we could with $1,000. And I think I want to wrap up this point by saying that I think it presents an empowering message that as individuals, we really can make a big difference, even if we don't have a lot of money to give, and that really where we give strategically might matter more than how much.
Those are really great metaphors. I mean, that's this person in a skyscraper, and that's really amazing. Have they done research on what makes a particular charity more effective than another?
Yeah, so I mean, there's many ways to think about this, and there isn't one universally agreed upon way. But one framework that I think is quite compelling has sort of three components to it, which is that effective charities, at least the problems that they address, are following these three criteria, which is that they're big in scale. So they affect a lot of individuals as opposed to fewer. Seems pretty obvious, not that controversial. The second is that they're often low-hanging fruit solutions for dealing with such problems. So basically, there's really cheap or cost-effective ways of making a difference. And the third is that these problems receive comparatively less attention. So if, for example, if some cause already receives a lot of funding, then it's very unlikely that they can do as much good per dollar as a cause that doesn't receive as much attention, all other things controlled for. And so what this leads to is things like extreme poverty, animal welfare, and mitigating global catastrophic risks as examples of such pressing global problems that seem to meet these criteria, in that they seem to be quite important. Oftentimes they're really cheap things we can do to make a difference, and like I said, are comparatively neglected. So just to provide a couple quick examples in the domain of extreme poverty and global health, there's this wonderful organization called Helen Keller International that has a vitamin A supplementation program, which can provide a year's worth of vitamin supplements, which are critical for children's nutritional development. And without it, they can be inflicted with many horrible diseases and illnesses. And it costs only $2 for one child to be protected for an entire year. So just remarkable in terms of impact per dollar. And the second is the Against Malaria Foundation, which provides insecticide-treated bed nets to people living mostly in sub-Saharan Africa to protect them from malaria, which is a very painful and potentially deadly disease. And for only $5, one net can protect two people for 2 to 3 years, I believe. So just incredible amounts of impact for such little amount of money. And so I just wanted to highlight those as a couple examples.
And when you say mitigating global catastrophic risks, is that where environmentalism fits in, or environmental causes not one of the causes?
Yeah, so that does fit in. I think it depends on your definition of catastrophic risk, but I think typically is considered to fit in there. Other sort of specific risks in that domain include things like risks of nuclear war or pandemics potentially far deadlier than COVID, or the uncertainty with rapid advances in artificial intelligence and what that might mean for sort of the future of our humanity and just our collective future.
Right. And if people want to hear more about that, we have a podcast episode interviewing Darren McKee, who wrote a book about that recently. All right, let's get into the psychology then. So when people hear about which charities are the most effective, does that make them change the way they donate?
So sometimes, but for most people, no. And even if they are one of that group that does, it typically doesn't move them that much. And this is because giving away your hard-earned dollars can be an extremely personal process. And, this is very understandable. And so people typically have causes very near and dear to their heart, whether that's supporting, an organization in their local community, like a school or a religious organization or something like that. Or perhaps giving back in honor of a loved one who might have, for example, had some horrendous disease that they want to help, donate to provide funding for research to address that problem. And so when we make purchases for ourselves, in contrast, it makes sense to get the most bang for our buck. This is something that's like quite intuitive for us. But we don't really apply this mindset when it comes to donating, which, like I said, just kind of feels like a much more personal process. And there's a great research paper by Jonathan Berman and colleagues that attest to this, where they find that, for things like investing, like financial investments, that people agree it makes sense to maximize your ROI. You want to make as much money back as you can in the market. But that when it comes to donating to charity, that people think that you should support the causes that you care about, even if you know that it's less effective than alternative options.
Wow, that's kind of depressing. Okay, well, that wouldn't be a problem if people naturally gave to effective charities, but are the charities that are quite popular, are they particularly effective?
Well, I don't want to criticize charities for being ineffective, and there's certainly many ways to define what effective means. And so I don't want to sort of go down that road, but people naturally aren't really inclined to give to the most effective charities, at least by the standards that I sort of said from the outset. And that's because, a lot of people just don't really know about what these highly effective charities are, or even that there are evaluators that exist that are experts that try to determine the most cost-effective organizations per dollar. So there's really two overarching reasons why people might not tend to give to effective charities naturally. The first, like I mentioned, is people just don't know, but the second is maybe they just don't care. And so on the caring side of things, people tend to feel moved by things like current events. So, if there's a natural disaster that makes the news, typically donations really are funneled in that direction, and that makes sense. As well as by things that like personal connection, which is a theme I've touched on a few times already. So if people are really connected to their local community, they feel like they've benefited from others and they want to give back, or feel just like really a deep emotional connection, they might want to contribute that way, or supporting a loved one, like I talked about as well. And this for me rang true as well before I learned anything about effective giving, which is that, I basically donated when people asked me to. My friends and family said, "Hey, I'm raising money for a marathon I'm running or my birthday or whatever it might be." Or maybe I saw a bad thing on the news and I just was moved by that and I felt compelled to give. And that's, I think, very common in terms of how people tend to donate, is these situations that pop up spontaneously as opposed to, thinking through the evidence. And I don't think that's necessarily something we should criticize or shame, but I think it's still worth paying attention to what the experts are saying in terms of making the most difference per dollar. Right.
And as have there been studies on which factors influence what charities people tend to give to?
Yeah, I mean, so there are many factors, but probably the most important ones are the emotional ones. And this is, I'm going to keep hammering this point home of personal connection being really important. So, people might feel connected to their religious organizations, loved ones that have been inflicted with some disease, whatever it might be. And so I think that's probably going to be your primary driver of donation decisions. Another is that our minds are really wired towards feeling the most amount of empathy towards a single individual as opposed to statistics or groups of individuals, which is just much harder to sort of resonate with on an emotional level. And in fact, there's research showing that people who give based on empathy as opposed to people who give deliberately are judged more positively. So I think that not only do people tend to give this way, but they reap social rewards for doing so. And then the last aspect, which is really critical, is that people want to feel good about doing good. And this is the sort of proverbial warm glow that you feel every time you engage in some sort of pro-social behavior that helps somebody else. But the thing is, our minds were evolved in contexts that are very different in which we live today. So you might feel this warm and fuzzy feeling if you pay for somebody's Starbucks behind you in line to, when you're grabbing coffee. But if you donate $1,000 just by punching in your credit card on a website, it's helping people living thousands of miles away to helping some of the most cost-effective organizations in the world, it might not even register emotionally that much. And so there's this huge disconnect between sort of our feelings when it comes to doing good and the objective amount of good that we do.
Yeah, I've got a story of just for me. So I give to the Against Malaria Foundation that you mentioned. I've given a lot to it. But one time I was walking down the street to get a bubble tea, and I passed by this guy waiting for a bus without shoes on. And I said, "Man, you got no shoes?" And and he had the same size shoes as me, and my shoes were starting to get slightly scuffed or whatever. And I just gave him my shoes, and he couldn't even put them on. I had to put them on for him, whatever. And then I, walked barefoot and got my bubble tea and went home. And when I tell people the story, they're just like, "Oh, Jim! Oh, yes, it's so wonderful." And I tell them about donating, $5,000 or whatever to Against Malaria Foundation. But not only other people, even myself, I even felt like I would say comparably proud, for giving somebody a pair of shoes, than, $5,000 to the Against Malaria Foundation, I think saves about 30 years of life. So, that was my experience with it.
That's fantastic. And I want to emphasize that acts like that are phenomenal and we shouldn't be discouraging them. I don't think these are either or situations where you can give to the Against Malaria Foundation and engage in these everyday acts that do make an impact and make you feel good as well, so that you reap the emotional rewards and that you're making a big difference to some of the most trusted organizations in the world in terms of donating. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. And we should celebrate that.
Well, okay, I'm going to push back a little bit on that, and it'll transition nicely into Giving Multiplier and what that's doing. But don't you kind of feel that people's goodwill is somewhat of a limited resource that can sort of get spent, like I gave at the office, and if the more that they give to less effective things, the more it takes away from more effective giving?
Well, sure. I agree that people have limited resources, at least monetarily, right? So a lot of people have budgets of saying, I'm going to give X% of my income or X dollars to charity this year. And the more I give to my local community, the less that I'm giving to the most cost-effective organization in the world. That might be true. And then there might be similar sort of resource constraints with people's motivations or attention or things like that. But there's also ways to, I think, I don't think that they have to be mutually exclusive. I think that they can work in concert together. I'm happy to talk more about Giving Multiplier as actually quite a nice solution to this problem.
Yeah. Okay. So I do think it's a clever solution. So as we mentioned, Dr. Coleman works for an organization called Giving Multiplier based on a novel idea about how to motivate people to give more effectively. Why don't you tell us a bit about the organization and the research that it's based on?
Yeah, so Giving Multiplier was co-founded in 2020 by Professor Joshua Green, who's a psychology professor at Harvard, as well as Lucius Caviola, who is a senior research fellow at Oxford at the Global Priorities Institute, who used to be Josh's postdoc when they co-founded the organization. And basically, they were trying to test different psychologically backed ways of inspiring people to give effectively. And when you try to persuade people with rational argument, some people find that convincing but most don't. And as opposed to trying to tell people not to give to the causes near and dear to them, they came up with what I think is a great solution to this heart versus head dilemma that we've been talking about, which is just do both. So as opposed to saying stop giving to causes personally meaningful to you, why not have this yes and approach where you support your local causes or whatever is emotionally, pulling at your heartstrings, and also support one of our expert recommended organizations and split between them. And what's kind of neat is that this bundling technique, so this heart and head split, leads people to end up giving 76% more to the effective charities. And they end up being more satisfied with the donation process itself, seeing it as more fair. And then they're also viewed as more warm and competent by others than if they just gave to their favorite charity or just to the effective charity alone. So I think that there's social rewards for this, and people enjoy it. They feel good. And the final boost here that I think is really compelling is that we have a matching system at Giving Multiplier. So all donations are boosted across both organizations, so your favorite and effective charity. And the research that Josh and Lucius published on this found that adding this matching system led to an additional 55% increase in donations to effective charities.
Wow, that's amazing. That's so cool. Okay, so let's talk about some of your other research. You've been doing some research about how much people care about people of the future. Many of the effective charities that are out there are about helping people right now, global health and that kind of thing. But you've done work on how much people care about the problems that will be relevant primarily or only in the future. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, and I want to start by saying that there are already enough current problems in the world that it's very understandable to not want to think about the risks that might loom ahead. But I do think it's worth doing so, and so we're interested, my colleagues and I, in really understanding how people feel towards future others, especially compared to the present. And this is really motivated by research showing that experts tend to think that catastrophic risks are potentially likely, or at least reasonably likely, this century. So a recent survey found that the median expert thinks there is a 20% likelihood of an existential catastrophe by 2100. And these are domain experts across, I believe, domains such as climate change, pandemics, AI, and nuclear war. And this is, at least to me, quite alarming. And so I wanted to study how do people actually feel towards future others, and how does this relate towards caring about the long-term future. And so basically, I conducted this study with my graduate advisor, David DeSteno, and we randomly assigned subjects to read about a hypothetical person, suffering either in the present or in the future. So they saw only one of these two conditions. And then we asked them how much empathy they felt, so how distressed and how concerned they felt towards that other person's suffering. And what we found is that despite people feeling that or predicting that the same amount of pain was being experienced in the present versus future scenarios, that people just felt less empathy towards the future other than the present other. And so this is sort of, one research paper that I that was sort of the focus of my dissertation research in graduate school.
Okay, so let me go over this again. Just so people care, we know people care less about people in the future than people now. And you were trying to find out, is that because they actually think they're suffering less, or that they know they're suffering just as much, but they just don't have as much compassion about it? Is that the essence of it?
Yeah, right. That's right.
And you found that they do think that the pain is the same, right?
Right.
Was there any difference, or was it just completely insignificant about the future pain?
Yeah, so it depended on the study. They were mostly insignificant, some were marginal, and they were sort of typically trending in the direction of people predicting slightly more pain in the present than in the future. We think this is mostly driven by misunderstandings that we tried to control for. So people just made up these sort of ad hoc reasons why people in the future might experience less pain, as in like, oh, well, maybe there's technological advancements that lead them to have like robotics, prosthetics that reduce that pain or something like that. So we try to control for these confounds. And then, we reliably found that there was no effects of predicted pain between the present and future.
Yeah. And so what do we know about why people care less about future persons?
Yeah, so it seems to be that it has to do with uncertainty. So basically, the future is uncertain and the present is not, basically by definition. And therefore, when the future is uncertain, it's harder to imagine. It's more challenging to visualize. The future is comparatively vague and abstract. And so this seems to be one of the main reasons underlying this effect. And interestingly, we deployed this brief intervention, this technique where we made the future more vivid. So basically we asked participants to just imagine this future person in concrete detail for like 20, 30 seconds. And we found this completely eliminated the gap in empathy between present and future others. So making the future more concrete and tangible and easier to conjure in one's mind made the future feel more like the present.
Wow, excellent. Okay, this is interesting. Some of the world's problems are obviously psychological in nature, like depression and mental illness and suicide and stuff. But many problems are, it's interesting that whatever the problem is, our understanding of the mind is relevant to our solving them, right? It's to effectively deal with them, we need to understand the psychology of the people who can potentially help.
Yeah, I mean, after all, like it's humans that are pulling the levers, at least right now, based on the current technological, like state of the art technology. And so we're pulling the levers in terms of, like decisions related to medicine and so on. And also like, economic forces and political will, these things are ultimately shaped by humans' preferences and choices. So I think that, in order to build a better future, we really need to know how people think about big societal problems. So how likely are they? How bad are they? How much should we invest in mitigating them? And also understanding how people feel towards others that might be affected by such problems. And doing so could help us sort of develop strategies for improving our collective future.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. We've been talking to Matthew Coleman from Giving Multiplier. And Matt, where can people get more information about you and your organization?
You can check out givingmultiplier.org. And we actually created a special invite code for your listeners. So if you type in minding, or if you go to givingmultiplier.org/minding, you will get a boosted matching rate for any donations you make on our website.
Oh, so you're telling me people can be more effective in their charities if they listen to my podcast. I love it.
Absolutely, of course.